The scorching Nevada desert sun beat down on the military shooting range. 12 young recruits, all wearing immaculate uniforms, lay in the sniper position, their precision rifles aimed at distant targets. Instructor Sergeant Reynolds, a 45-year-old man with an athletic build and stern expression, walked among them, shouting orders. "This is pathetic. Not a single accurate shot at 800 meters. You're the worst class I've ever trained." The recruits remained silent, sweating not only from the heat, but from frustration. 3 days of intensive training and none of them had managed to hit the most distant targets. Sergeant Reynolds had every right to be furious. They were candidates for the elite Special Forces sniper team. About 50 meters away, an elderly man observed the scene. Walter Griffith, 78 years old, was visiting the base at the invitation of an old friend, General Harrison. Walter wore a simple plaid shirt, worn jeans, and a faded cap that shielded his weather-beaten face from the sun. His hands, marked by age spots and prominent veins, occasionally trembled slightly, but his blue eyes remained clear and attentive. "These kids couldn't hit the broadside of a barn," Sergeant Reynolds shouted, looking at his clipboard in disgust. "At this rate, none of you will qualify." Walter watched as one young recruit, his face red with embarrassment, missed another shot. The wind in the desert was tricky, changing direction constantly, but Walter knew that wasn't the only problem. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Walter asked General Harrison, his voice quiet but firm. "Of course not, old friend," replied the general. "Just don't interfere with the training." Walter nodded and slowly made his way toward the firing line. His steps were measured but confident. As he approached, Sergeant Reynolds noticed him and frowned. "Sir, this is a restricted area. I'm going to have to ask you to step back," Reynolds said, his tone dismissive. General Harrison stepped forward. "This is Walter Griffith. He's here at my invitation, Sergeant." Reynolds nodded curtly, clearly unhappy with the interruption, but unable to object to the general's authority. "With all due respect, sir, we're in the middle of qualifying exercises." "Exercises that aren't going well," Walter observed quietly, his eyes scanning the range. Reynolds bristled. "And I suppose you think you could do better, old-timer?" A hint of a smile crossed Walter's weathered face. "I might have a few suggestions." "Suggestions?" Reynolds scoffed. "These are the most sophisticated sniper rifles in the world. The ballistics are complex. The environmental factors alone, the wind shifting from the southwest, about 3 miles per hour," Walter interrupted calmly. "And your recruits are all compensating the wrong way." Reynolds looked at Walter with growing irritation. "Sir, with all due respect, I've been training snipers for 15 years. And I've been shooting since before you were born," Walter replied. No challenge in his voice, just a simple statement of fact. The recruits had stopped shooting and were watching the exchange with interest. General Harrison stood back, an amused expression on his face. "Maybe you'd like to demonstrate for us?" Reynolds said sarcastically, holding out his own rifle. "Show us all how it's done?" Walter looked at the general, who gave him a subtle nod. "I suppose I could take a shot," Walter said, accepting the rifle from Reynolds. As Walter took the weapon, his hand stopped trembling. He checked the rifle methodically, his movements precise and practiced. The recruits exchanged glances, some smirking, others curious. "I'll bet $50 he doesn't hit anything," one of them whispered. Walter lay down carefully in the shooting position, adjusting his body with the expertise of someone who had done this thousands of times before. He peered through the scope, taking his time, feeling the subtle breeze on his face. The targets were positioned at various distances, from 300 to 1,000 meters. Walter focused on the furthest one, the one none of the recruits had managed to hit. He took a deep breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle echoed across the range. Through their own scopes, the recruits could see that Walter had hit the target dead center. Without saying a word, Walter adjusted his aim slightly and fired again. Another perfect hit. And again. And again. 5 shots. 5 perfect hits on the most distant target. The range fell silent. Sergeant Reynolds stared at Walter, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. "That was impressive," Reynolds finally admitted, his earlier arrogance noticeably diminished. Walter handed the rifle back, his expression humble. "It's a fine weapon, just needs the right touch." One of the recruits, a young man named Jenkins, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, how did you do that? We've been trying for days." Before Walter could answer, another voice cut in. "Because he's not just any old man," General Harrison said, walking up to stand beside his friend. "Recruits, meet Walter Griffith, former Master Sergeant with the 5th Special Forces Group, one of the finest snipers the U.S. Army has ever produced." The recruits' expressions changed from confusion to awe. Reynolds looked shocked. "Griffith? The Walter Griffith? From Vietnam?" Reynolds asked, his voice suddenly respectful. Walter shrugged uncomfortably. "That was a long time ago." "Sir," Reynolds said, now standing at attention, "your record of confirmed long-distance eliminations stood unbroken for almost 30 years. We study your techniques in advanced courses." Walter nodded slightly, but seemed unwilling to dwell on his accomplishments. Instead, he turned to the recruits. "You're all making the same mistake. You're not accounting for the thermal uplift from the desert floor." Walter knelt beside the nearest recruit, a young woman named Martinez. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her rifle. She nodded eagerly, and Walter made a small adjustment to her scope settings. "Try now," he suggested. "But remember to feel the wind on your face, not just read the gauges." Martinez repositioned herself, took a deep breath, and fired. Her shot hit the 800-meter target, not perfectly centered like Walter's, but a definite hit. Her face broke into a wide smile. "How did you do that?" she asked, amazed. Walter smiled gently. "The instruments tell you part of the story, but they can't feel what you feel. Shooting is as much art as science." For the next hour, Walter moved among the recruits, offering quiet suggestions, making minor adjustments to their positions or their equipment. With each of his corrections, their accuracy improved dramatically. Sergeant Reynolds watched, at first skeptically, then with growing respect. By the end of the session, every recruit had successfully hit targets they had been missing for days. "I owe you an apology, sir," Reynolds said to Walter when they were finished. "I had no idea who you were." Walter waved away the apology. "No need for that. These kids are good. They just needed a little fine-tuning." As they were packing up the equipment, a recruit named Davis approached Walter. "Sir, is it true what they say about you saving an entire platoon in '68? Walter's eyes clouded slightly, and for a moment he seemed transported back to another time, another place. The humid air of the Vietnamese jungle, the sound of mortar fire in the distance, the weight of responsibility for the lives of 18 young men. "It wasn't just me," Walter finally said. "We all did what needed doing." General Harrison put his hand on Walter's shoulder. "He's being modest." Walter held off an enemy battalion for 6 hours with just his rifle after his spotter was wounded, gave our medevac helicopters time to get in and out, saved 18 lives that day. The recruits looked at Walter with renewed respect, but the old sniper seemed uncomfortable with the attention. "That was a different life," Walter said quietly. "A different war." Days, as the sun began to set over the Nevada desert, casting long shadows across the range, Walter found himself surrounded by the recruits. They peppered him with questions about techniques, about equipment, about experiences they could only imagine. Walter answered patiently, sharing knowledge gained from decades of experience. As Sergeant Reynolds watched, he saw the recruits absorbing not just technical information, but something more valuable, the wisdom and perspective that only came with years of service. Later, as Walter and General Harrison walked back to the base buildings, the general smiled at his old friend. "You know, those kids learned more in 1 hour with you than they would have in a week with Reynolds," Harrison said. Walter shrugged. They just needed someone to listen to what they were really asking. Not all questions are spoken out loud. "The training center could use someone like you," Harrison suggested casually. "Not full-time, of course, but maybe a few days a month, as a special consultant." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering me a job, Harrison?" "I'm offering you a purpose," the general replied. "These young people need more than technical training. They need mentors who understand what they're really signing up for." The following morning, Walter sat in the mess hall with a cup of black coffee, watching as recruits and instructors filed in for breakfast. He had spent a restless night, Harrison's offer weighing on his mind. After Sarah had passed 3 years ago, Walter had retreated into a quiet, solitary life in his small Montana cabin. The idea of stepping back into the military world, even in a consulting role, seemed daunting. His thoughts were interrupted when Sergeant Reynolds approached his table. "Mind if I join you, sir?" Reynolds asked, his tone markedly more respectful than the previous day. Walter gestured to the empty chair. "Be my guest." Reynolds set down his tray and sat, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I wanted to apologize properly for yesterday. I was out of line." "Water under the bridge," Walter replied with a small smile. "You didn't know who I was." "That's no excuse for disrespect," Reynolds said, shaking his head. "The truth is, I was frustrated. This group has potential, but I couldn't seem to get through to them." Walter nodded, understanding the challenge. "Training has changed since my day." "That's just it," Reynolds leaned forward. "The technology, the weapons, the tactics, they've all evolved. But the fundamentals you showed yesterday, those haven't changed at all." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jenkins and Martinez, 2 of the recruits from yesterday's session. "Master Sergeant Griffith," Jenkins said, standing at attention. "We wanted to thank you for your help yesterday." "At ease," Walter said, gesturing for them to sit. "And it's just Walter now. I've been retired longer than you've been alive." The recruits sat, their posture still respectful but less formal. "We were hoping," Martinez began, then hesitated. "We were hoping you might be willing to share more of your experience with us," Jenkins finished. "Maybe some stories from Vietnam." Walter's face clouded slightly. Vietnam wasn't something he talked about often, too many painful memories buried there. But looking at these young faces, eager and earnest, he found himself nodding. "I suppose I could share a few things," he said. "But not all war stories are suitable for breakfast conversation." For the next hour, Walter found himself surrounded by a growing group of recruits, sharing carefully selected anecdotes from his service, focusing on teamwork, adaptability, and the mental aspects of marksmanship rather than the horrors of war. As the mess hall began to clear, General Harrison appeared, observing the scene with satisfaction. "Looks like you've found an audience," he commented, joining the group. Walter shrugged. "Just sharing some old war stories." "Well, your old war stories seem to be more effective than our current training manual," Harrison replied. "Have you given any thought to my offer?" Before Walter could answer, alarms began blaring throughout the base. The recruits jumped to their feet, looking toward their sergeant for instructions. "What's happening?" Walter asked, instantly alert despite his years away from active service. "Range fire," Harrison said grimly, listening to updates through his radio. "The Western Training Ground. Lightning strike from last night's storm must have smoldered until now. Reynolds was already organizing his recruits. Martinez, Jenkins, Davis, report to the West Gate for evacuation duty. The rest of you, equipment security detail." Harrison turned to Walter. "You should head to the evacuation zone with the non-essential personnel." Walter started to protest, but saw the logic in not having a 78-year-old civilian in the way during an emergency. He nodded and began walking toward the designated evacuation area. As he approached the western edge of the base, Walter could see smoke billowing over the ridge. Fire crews were mobilizing, but the dry conditions and increasing wind were causing the fire to spread rapidly toward one of the remote training facilities. "There's still people in Bunker 3, a young lieutenant shouted into his radio. "We can't reach them by vehicle. The access road is already engulfed." Walter felt a chill despite the desert heat. Bunker 3 was the underground facility visible from the sniper range. The one he had noted was positioned unfortunately close to the dry brush fields. "How many?" Harrison demanded, arriving on the scene. "4 personnel, sir. 2 instructors and 2 maintenance workers. They're reporting smoke in the ventilation system." Harrison surveyed the situation grimly. The fire had created a barrier between the main base and Bunker 3. The only approach not yet affected by fire was a narrow ravine that ran from their position to the bunker, a 600-meter stretch of exposed ground with minimal cover. "We need volunteers for a rescue team," Harrison announced. "The ravine approach is our only option." Several soldiers immediately stepped forward, including Reynolds and some of his recruits. Walter stood back, watching as Harrison organized the team, distributing emergency breathing apparatus and communications equipment. As the rescue team prepared to depart, Walter noticed one of the firefighters examining a topographical map of the area. He moved closer to look over the man's shoulder. "The wind's shifting," the firefighter was saying. "If it continues in this direction, the fire will cut off the ravine exit in approximately 12 minutes. Walter glanced at his watch, then at the rescue team. At their current pace, they would need at least 20 minutes to reach the bunker and return with the trapped personnel. Without conscious decision, Walter found himself walking toward Harrison. "The ravine approach won't work," he said quietly. "They won't make it back before the fire cuts them off." Harrison looked at him sharply. "We don't have another option." "You do," Walter replied, pointing to a ridge that ran parallel to the ravine. "That high ground there, it's about a 30-degree slope, but it leads directly to the bunker's emergency exit on the east side." Harrison squinted at the ridge. "That's a near vertical climb at some points, and completely exposed to the fire." "Not completely," Walter said. "There's a natural stone outcropping that creates a barrier about halfway up. If your team can reach that point, they'll have protection from the worst of the heat and smoke." Harrison considered this, then shook his head. "Too risky. We'd need someone who knows exactly where that outcropping is, and we don't have time to scout it." Walter took a deep breath. "I know where it is. I spotted it yesterday from the range." The realization of what Walter was suggesting dawned slowly on Harrison's face. "Absolutely not," the general said firmly. "You're 78 years old, Walter. And I spent 6 years mapping terrain like this in Vietnam," Walter countered. "I know what I'm looking at." Before Harrison could protest further, Reynolds joined them, catching the tail end of their conversation. "Sir," Reynolds addressed Walter, "are you saying you can guide us up that ridge?" Walter nodded. "I can do more than guide. I can lead." Harrison started to object again, but Walter cut him off with a raised hand. "James," he said, using the general's first name, "there are 4 people in that bunker who will die if we don't reach them in time. I may be old, but I know that terrain, and I still know how to move through hostile territory." The determined look in Walter's eyes was one Harrison recognized from decades ago, the same expression Walter had worn when he'd volunteered for the most dangerous missions in Vietnam. "Give him gear," Harrison finally ordered, his voice resigned. "And Reynolds, you stay with him every step of the way." Within minutes, Walter was equipped with emergency breathing apparatus, a communication headset, and protective clothing. Reynolds assembled a small team, himself, Jenkins, and Martinez, to accompany Walter. "We move fast, and we move smart," Walter instructed as they prepared to depart. The key is reaching that stone outcropping. Once we're there, we'll have cover all the way to the bunker's emergency exit. The small rescue team set out, Walter setting a pace that surprised the younger members. They moved along the base of the ridge until Walter signaled for them to begin their ascent. The climb was grueling. The loose desert soil gave way under their feet, and the heat from the approaching fire made breathing difficult even through their protective gear. Halfway up, Martinez slipped, sliding several meters before Jenkins managed to catch her arm. "Take 5 steps to your left," Walter called to them. "The ground is more stable there." He was right. The soil in that direction was compacted and provided better footing. They continued climbing, guided by Walter's instructions, until they reached the stone outcropping he had identified. Just as Walter had predicted, the natural formation provided a barrier between them and the advancing fire. From this vantage point, they could see the emergency exit of Bunker 3 just 50 meters above them. "Reynolds, you and Jenkins get to that door," Walter instructed. "Martinez and I will secure this position as your fallback point." Reynolds hesitated. "Sir, the General ordered me to stay with you." "And I'm ordering you to get those people out," Walter replied, his voice taking on the unmistakable command tone of a master sergeant. "That's what we came for." Reynolds nodded, and he and Jenkins scrambled up toward the bunker door. Walter and Martinez watched as they reached it, forced it open, and disappeared inside. Minutes passed. The fire was advancing more rapidly now, threatening to cut off their descent route. Walter checked his watch, calculating how much time they had left. "If they're not out in 3 minutes, we'll have to go in after them," he told Martinez. Just as Walter was preparing to make the climb to the bunker door, Reynolds emerged, helping a coughing woman in a lab coat. Behind him, Jenkins supported an older man who appeared to be injured. "2 more inside," Reynolds shouted down to them. "One's unconscious!" Without hesitation, Walter started climbing toward the bunker. Martinez followed close behind. Inside, they found a maintenance worker unconscious from smoke inhalation and another instructor struggling to drag him toward the exit. Walter immediately assessed the situation. "Martinez, take his shoulders. I'll get his feet," Walter instructed, moving to position himself despite the thick smoke filling the bunker. Together, they lifted the unconscious man and began making their way back to the exit. The instructor followed, coughing violently. Outside, they rejoined Reynolds and Jenkins with the first 2 evacuees. The fire was now visible on 3 sides, closing in rapidly. "Down the way we came," Walter ordered. "Stay close to the rock face." The descent was even more treacherous than the climb. The heat was intense, and the smoke made visibility poor. Walter led the way, calling out warnings about loose soil and rocks, guiding them exactly the way they had come up. They were halfway down when the unconscious maintenance worker regained consciousness and began to panic, nearly causing Martinez to lose her grip on him. Walter's calm voice cut through the man's fear. "You're in good hands, son. These soldiers know what they're doing. Just keep moving toward my voice." The man's panic subsided, and they continued their descent. When they finally reached the base of the ridge, emergency medical teams rushed forward to take the injured and smoke-affected personnel. Harrison was waiting, his face showing both relief and lingering concern. "Everyone accounted for?" he asked Reynolds. "Yes, sir. All 4 personnel evacuated safely," Reynolds reported, then added with unmistakable respect, "Thanks to Master Sergeant Griffith's guidance." Walter, now sitting on the ground catching his breath, waved away the praise. "It was a team effort." Harrison knelt beside his old friend. "You're still the most stubborn, reckless soldier I've ever known, Walter Griffith." Walter managed a tired smile. "Some things never change, I guess." As the medical team checked him over, Walter watched the younger soldiers helping the evacuees. Jenkins caught his eye and gave him a respectful nod. Martinez, after ensuring her patient was safely with the medics, came to stand beside him. "I've never seen anything like that, sir," she said quietly. "The way you read that terrain, how you kept everyone calm." Walter looked up at her. "That's what experience gives you. Not just skills, but judgment. Something you can't learn from a manual." Indeed, 3 days later, Walter found himself back at the sniper range. This time, instead of observing from a distance, he was positioned among the recruits, offering guidance as they practiced their shots. The improvement was remarkable. Every recruit was now hitting targets at 800 meters with consistent accuracy. Reynolds stood back, allowing Walter to lead the training session. When they finished for the day, Harrison appeared, watching as the recruits gathered around Walter, asking questions and absorbing his advice. "You've made quite an impression," Harrison observed when the recruits had finally dispersed. Walter shrugged. "They're good kids, eager to learn." "I've received the official report about the bunker evacuation," Harrison said. "Your actions saved 4 lives, Walter." "Like I said, team effort." Harrison smiled. "The Pentagon doesn't see it that way. They're quite interested in the 78-year-old retired Master Sergeant who outperformed active duty personnel in a crisis situation." Walter groaned. "I'm not looking for recognition, James." "I know that," Harrison replied. "But my offer still stands. These recruits need someone like you, someone who can teach them what doesn't appear in the training manuals." Walter looked out across the range, where Reynolds was conducting maintenance checks with some of the recruits. He thought about the past few days, the sense of purpose he had felt, the satisfaction of passing on his knowledge to a new generation. 3 days a month, Walter finally said. "That's all I'm willing to commit to." Harrison grinned. "That's more than I hoped for." As the sun began to set over the Nevada desert, Walter Griffith stood watching the recruits pack up their equipment. For the first time since Sarah's passing, he felt a sense of belonging, a connection to something beyond his solitary existence. He thought about what these young men and women would face in their careers, the challenges, the decisions, the weight of responsibility, and knew that whatever wisdom he could share might someday make a difference in a moment when it truly mattered. And for an old soldier, there could be no greater purpose than that.